the ice cream truck was still parked when Rachel Sutton vanished in the town of Pinewood, Texas. Population 8,745. The evening of June 8, 2006, was unusually hot, with temperatures hovering near 100 degrees even as the sun began to set, baking the small town's cracked sidewalks and wilting the marigolds in front of the town hall. At 8:32 p.m., a traffic camera at the intersection of Magnolia Drive and Willow Creek Road captured Rachel's silver Toyota Corolla rolling through a yellow light, the silhouette of her blonde ponytail visible in the driver's seat before the car disappeared down a stretch of highway flanked by pine trees. Rachel, 28, a beloved third-grade teacher at Pinewood Elementary, was on her way to pick up her younger sister from band practice. By morning, her phone was silent, her apartment untouched, and mild concern quickly escalated to paralyzing fear. In the weeks that followed, the town was torn apart by speculation, overlooked evidence, and the shadow of an unseen predator seemingly hiding within their tight-knit community. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What unfolded from that sweltering June night would haunt Pinewood for years, challenging the town's faith in those they believed they knew inside and out. On the evening of June 8, 2006, Pinewood, Texas rested in its familiar summer rhythm, where wide streets led to cotton fields and weathered ranch houses baked under an unforgiving sun. But as cicadas began their evening chorus, an event that would forever scar the community was silently unfolding. Rachel Sutton had spent the afternoon in her classroom, preparing for the next day's end-of-year party. The school's janitor later recalled her cheerful humming as she hung construction paper stars from the ceiling, mentioning she needed to pick up her 16-year-old sister, Emma, from the high school's evening band practice. It was a simple routine, an ordinary moment in the steady life of a young woman treasured for her dedication to her students and warm smile. Around 8:25 p.m., Rachel left the elementary school parking lot in her silver Toyota Corolla, the car her father had gifted her when she graduated college. A traffic camera at the main intersection captured what would become a critical moment at 8:32 p.m., Rachel's Corolla passing through as the light turned yellow, heading toward the high school on the other side of town. The blurry footage only showed the flash of silver paint and the faint outline of her profile, hair pulled back in her characteristic ponytail. It was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. After that, Rachel disappeared without explanation, as if the familiar highway had swallowed both her and her car. No message to her sister waiting at the school, no call to her parents who lived just 3 streets over from the elementary school. No one saw the Corolla reach the high school just 2 miles down the road. Only a sudden, inexplicable void remained, and an eerie silence fell over a town unaccustomed to such mysteries. On the morning of June 9, the Texas sun blazed mercilessly over Pinewood's dusty streets. But in the modest brick house on Cottonwood Lane, Margaret Sutton began the day with growing anxiety. Typically, Rachel would have texted after picking up Emma, but there had been no messages all night. Margaret had spent a restless night calling both daughters repeatedly. Emma had been picked up by a friend's mother when Rachel never arrived, but Rachel's phone rang endlessly without answer. Margaret tried to convince herself that perhaps Rachel had suffered car trouble and her phone had died, or maybe she'd gone to help a friend with an emergency. But as morning arrived with no word, her worry crystallized into genuine terror. At 9:15 a.m., Margaret called Rachel's boyfriend, Tyler Delaney, a local veterinarian whom she assumed Rachel might have visited after picking up Emma. Tyler's voice, thick with sleep, grew alert when Margaret asked if Rachel was with him. "No, I haven't heard from her since yesterday afternoon," he said, confusion evident in his tone. "She was supposed to call me after picking up Emma." "She never showed up to get Emma," Margaret whispered, and in the silence that followed, they both recognized something was terribly wrong. Within the hour, the Sutton family was searching every location Rachel frequented. The elementary school, Tyler's apartment, the homes of close friends. They called colleagues, the school principal, and neighbors, but no one had seen Rachel since the previous evening. Tyler, his face pale with worry, joined the family as they retraced Rachel's likely route. He recounted that Rachel had texted him at 5:30 p.m. the previous day, saying she'd call after picking up Emma, but that call never came. When Margaret called to say Rachel never arrived at the high school, he knew this wasn't just forgetfulness or a dead battery. By noon, the Sutton family contacted the Pinewood Police Department. The officer on duty recorded details about the silver Toyota Corolla, its license plate, and Rachel's appearance. However, the initial response from local law enforcement leaned toward caution rather than urgency. For missing adults, especially young women, the first assumption often trended toward voluntary absence or relationship troubles. A sergeant told Margaret that Rachel might simply need some time alone, perhaps due to end-of-school-year stress or personal matters. The family protested vehemently, insisting Rachel would never abandon her responsibility to her sister, let alone disappear without a word to her close-knit family. Nevertheless, the initial report was categorized as a voluntary missing person case, with further monitoring required before escalating resources. This lack of immediate action infuriated the Suttons but left them powerless as the authorities maintained that an adult missing for less than 24 hours didn't yet warrant a full-scale search operation. That evening, Tyler and Rachel's brother, Mark, drove around town themselves, following the route from the elementary school to the high school, a normally straightforward 5-minute drive that now felt endless. They stopped at the traffic intersection where the camera had captured Rachel, questioning the gas station attendant nearby. The attendant remembered seeing a silver car matching Rachel's pass-through but noticed nothing unusual. When the traffic camera footage was shown to police, they acknowledged it confirmed Rachel had left the school but maintained it proved little else, as the car could have continued anywhere after that point. Margaret left the police station with trembling hands, feeling as though the authorities didn't truly believe her daughter was in danger. Meanwhile, worry spread through the family. Rachel's father, Harold, a retired oil field worker, began calling hospitals and urgent care centers within a 50-mile radius. Relatives and friends gathered at the Sutton home, discussing search strategies, printing flyers, and calling every business along the route Rachel would have taken. The second night passed in agonizing suspense. Margaret sat motionless by the phone, making unanswered calls every 15 minutes. Tyler and Mark drove up and down the highway until dawn, their headlights sweeping across ditches and fields as if hoping the silver car would suddenly materialize where they'd seen it hundreds of times before. And somewhere out there, the mystery of Rachel Sutton began casting a long shadow over Pinewood, a town unaccustomed to such disturbing uncertainties. In the days that followed, Pinewood transformed from a sleepy Texas town into a community gripped by collective dread. From the early morning of June 10, 2006, dozens of volunteers gathered outside Pinewood Elementary School where Rachel taught. Her fellow teachers, who knew her as a dedicated educator with creative lesson plans and endless patience for struggling students, now wore heavy work boots and carried flashlights and walking sticks, ready to search every inch of the surrounding area. Word spread quickly through church groups and social media, and within hours hundreds joined in the effort. They split into teams, fanning out along Highway 27 between the elementary and high schools. They walked in straight lines just feet apart, scanning ditches, fields, and wooded areas for any sign, a piece of clothing, skid marks, a discarded purse. Along the roadside, people stapled flyers bearing Rachel's photograph, a 28-year-old with sun-streaked blonde hair and a warm smile, alongside bold red letters spelling missing. Last seen June 8, 2006. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Red River, which curved around Pinewood's northern boundary, became a focal point of the search. On the third day after Rachel's disappearance, the county sheriff deployed a search boat with sonar equipment to scan the riverbed where Highway 27 crossed over the water. Small boats crisscrossed the murky surface, operators watching screens displaying shadowy images of the river bottom, but nothing resembled a submerged sedan. Search dogs were brought in from Dallas, sniffing Rachel's clothing and methodically working their way through miles of terrain, but they returned with their handlers' hopeless headshakes. Despite the mounting frustration, no one considered stopping. Local media descended on the town. Outlets like the Pinewood Chronicle and regional TV stations from Fort Worth and Dallas provided constant updates. The evening news on June 12 opened with footage of search parties trudging through tall grass under the merciless Texas sun, interspersed with Margaret Sutton's tearful pleas for anyone with information to call the emergency hotline printed on the flyers. A small town rarely sees tragedy on this scale, the Dallas anchor solemnly intoned. But tonight, Pinewood stands united in shared anguish. As news spread, fear infected the community. Parents began escorting their daughters everywhere instead of allowing them to drive alone. The once bustling evening scene at the Bluebonnet Cafe and the town's only movie theater grew subdued, replaced by hushed conversations and nervous glances. Everyone wondered, if Rachel had indeed been abducted, could the perpetrator be among them, watching the search unfold? Amid mounting anxiety, false leads began to surface, exhausting police resources and the family's emotional reserves. A truck driver called claiming he'd seen a silver Corolla like Rachel's parked at a rest stop near the Oklahoma border. Police spent hours reviewing security footage only to discover it was a similar model with out-of-state plates. A woman at the grocery store insisted she'd spotted Rachel with an unfamiliar man at a gas station the morning after she vanished. Security cameras later proved it wasn't her. Each brief flicker of hope was quickly extinguished, leaving deeper disappointment in its wake. Cruel rumors also began circulating. Rachel had run away with a secret boyfriend, she was pregnant and hiding from her family, she'd embezzled money from the school's fundraising account. The Sutton family endured not only the agony of their daughter's disappearance but also these baseless whispers. Exhausted after sleepless days, Harold Sutton broke down during a TV interview when a reporter mentioned speculation that Rachel might have orchestrated her own disappearance. "My daughter would never abandon her sister waiting at that school," he said, voice breaking. "Rachel is responsible, loving, and dedicated to her family. Something happened to her that night, and instead of looking for who's responsible, people are inventing stories." Under pressure from the community and increasing media attention, police expanded their search. They deployed helicopters to scan rural roads, searched abandoned buildings, and established temporary checkpoints on highways leading out of town, hoping to find witnesses who might have seen the silver Corolla. But all efforts ended without success. By the seventh day, Pinewood descended into a heaviness unlike anything in its history. The police station bulletin board was covered with maps marking searched areas and possible routes. Tyler Delaney, haggard after a week of little sleep and constant searching, told a reporter, "I keep expecting to wake up and find this was just a nightmare. But then reality hits again, and Rachel's still missing." The community continued supporting the search, but exhaustion and confusion began taking their toll. Some whispered that Rachel might have left town for personal reasons. Others insisted a predator was targeting young women in the area. The competing theories created friction that threatened to derail the search effort. Yet, despite setbacks and growing divisions, each morning brought fresh groups of volunteers gathering in the elementary school parking lot, collecting maps, adjusting hats against the brutal summer sun, and heading out with determination. Pinewood, a town unaccustomed to such tragedy, now existed in suffocating suspense, waiting for any clue, any hint that might lead them to Rachel Sutton, the young teacher who vanished on a June evening, leaving an unfillable void in the hearts of those who loved her. In the first weeks after Rachel Sutton's disappearance, the Pinewood police investigation quickly focused on her boyfriend, Tyler Delaney. For investigators with limited experience in major cases, the statistically likely suspect was always the closest person to the victim. Tyler was called to the station repeatedly during the first week, enduring hours of questioning under harsh fluorescent lights. They asked about recent arguments, whether Rachel seemed afraid of anyone, if their relationship was troubled. Tyler, disheveled and exhausted from his own desperate searching, firmly maintained his innocence. He repeated that he'd been at the veterinary clinic until late that evening treating an emergency case, a dog that had been hit by a car, and then went straight home, falling asleep while waiting for Rachel's call. His alibi was verified by clinic staff and security cameras, and phone records confirmed he was at home when Rachel disappeared. After days of searching his apartment, car, and examining his phone, police found nothing suspicious. Public opinion, initially suspicious of Tyler, gradually shifted as evidence consistently cleared him of involvement. But this intense focus on the boyfriend meant other, potentially critical leads were overlooked during the investigation's crucial early hours. A witness living near Highway 27 called the police hotline 2 days after Rachel vanished. He reported that around 8:45 p.m. on June 8, while taking out his trash, he heard tires screeching and saw a silver sedan being closely followed by a dark pickup truck with oversized tires. He vividly recalled how aggressive the truck seemed, following unusually close to the smaller car's bumper as they sped past his property. The witness noted the time precisely because he'd just checked his watch, realizing he'd almost missed trash collection. But instead of treating this as an urgent lead, the report was filed as unverified because investigators were too preoccupied with the Tyler Delaney angle. Later analysis revealed this road was one of only 2 routes Rachel could have taken from the traffic camera location to the high school. Another overlooked clue came from a teenage girl who'd been at band practice with Emma Sutton. 3 days after Rachel's disappearance, her mother brought her to the station, saying her daughter had information. The girl, nervous and speaking softly, mentioned seeing a man in a dark truck parked near the high school band entrance around 8:30 p.m., right when Rachel would have been arriving. The man, wearing a baseball cap pulled low, remained in his vehicle watching the school entrance. The girl remembered feeling uneasy, enough that she'd pointed him out to her friend before they went inside. Yet, instead of creating a sketch or conducting further interviews with other band students, her statement was briefly noted in a report with minimal follow-up. No officer returned to question her further about the truck's make or model, or to create a composite of the driver. These oversights stemmed from tunnel vision. Investigators convinced themselves they had the most probable scenario, relationship trouble leading to either voluntary disappearance or foul play by the boyfriend. But when evidence completely cleared Tyler, they realized they'd wasted precious time. By the time they revisited initial reports, witnesses' memories had faded and the scenes were contaminated by weather and the hundreds of searchers who had trampled potential evidence sites. Margaret Sutton, in an emotional interview with the Dallas Morning News, couldn't hide her frustration. Instead of looking for my daughter, they just kept circling back to Tyler. Meanwhile, someone out there knows what happened, and every day that passes, our chances of finding Rachel get slimmer. Many Pinewood residents agreed with this assessment, feeling the local police department lacked experience handling a major missing person case, being more accustomed to dealing with minor theft, traffic violations, and occasional bar fights. As the hot Texas summer of 2006 wore on without progress, the case file grew thick with reports but remained devoid of actionable leads. Police had overlooked a suspicious truck following a car matching Rachel's. They failed to thoroughly investigate a strange man watching the high school at exactly the right time. Most crucially, they lost the initial trust of the Sutton family and the Pinewood community, who only wanted answers about what happened to Rachel on that sweltering June evening. Those early missteps not only stalled the investigation but planted seeds for years of anguish, suspicion, and unrelenting questions. Questions that would hang over Pinewood like the heavy summer air, waiting for answers that seemed increasingly unlikely to come. Pinewood was known for its community spirit, where neighbors still brought casseroles when someone fell ill and children played in front yards until sunset without concern. But after Rachel Sutton's disappearance, that familiar warmth was replaced by persistent unease. Streets once alive with teenagers riding bikes and young families taking evening walks grew eerily quiet, especially after dark. Parents who once allowed their daughters to drive alone to after-school activities now insisted on accompanying them. "Nobody goes anywhere by themselves anymore," one father told a reporter, his arm protectively around his teenage daughter's shoulders. Young women who used to meet friends at the Bluebonnet Cafe after work now arranged carpools and checked in with family members throughout the evening. Doors once left unlocked were now secured with deadbolts, and the town's hardware store sold out of security cameras and motion-sensing lights. Fear didn't just affect families, it blanketed the entire community. People whispered in grocery store aisles and at church gatherings, sharing theories and rumors. Some believed Rachel had been targeted by someone passing through town. Others murmured that the culprit might be someone familiar, perhaps even a neighbor or local business owner. Regardless of which scenario seemed more likely, Pinewood's sense of security, once its greatest pride, had eroded beyond recognition. Church groups, the backbone of the town's social structure, became gathering places for shared grief. During the first week after Rachel vanished, Pastor Mitchell at First Baptist Church held a special prayer service, inviting congregants to light candles for the young teacher's safe return. The sight of hundreds of candles flickering in the sanctuary, their light reflecting off stained glass windows depicting the Good Shepherd, became a powerful symbol of unity amid deepening uncertainty. Other religious communities held similar gatherings, reading scriptures and singing hymns, praying for Rachel's safe return. People placed flowers, handwritten notes, and stuffed animals outside her classroom door at Pinewood Elementary, turning the school entrance into a living memorial that grew larger each day. Police attempted to reassure residents, saying there was no evidence of a serial predator or widespread danger, but few found comfort in these words. When someone as beloved and deeply rooted in the community as Rachel could vanish without warning, anything seemed possible. Parents warned daughters against talking to strangers, accepting rides, or even jogging alone, activities that had once been commonplace in this close-knit town. The simplest habits changed. To outsiders, Pinewood might still appear to be a quaint Texas town with its water tower bearing the high school mascot and streets lined with American flags, but to its residents, it had become shrouded in suspicion. Amid this atmosphere of fear, the Sutton family faced not only Rachel's absence but also the community's unspoken questions. People came to offer support and pray with them, but there were also uncomfortable silences and averted gazes when they passed on the street. Pinewood had never confronted a case like this before, and Rachel's disappearance left the community struggling to recognize itself. Fear became the new normal, a thick, invisible barrier settling over a town once considered one of East Texas's most peaceful places to raise a family. From 2007 to 2013, Pinewood grew accustomed to the heavy silence surrounding Rachel Sutton's disappearance. After the initial frenzy of search parties, police statements, and media attention, everything slowly faded, like a fire starved of oxygen. The case went cold. Police moved the file to inactive status, and weather-beaten flyers on telephone poles disintegrated in the relentless Texas sun and occasional thunderstorms. But for the Sutton family, time didn't ease the pain, it only transformed it into something more permanent, more deeply embedded in their daily existence. Margaret Sutton, once known in town for her cheerful volunteering at the library and community center, became almost unrecognizable. She spent every day maintaining the Find Rachel Facebook page, posting memories, childhood photographs, and regular reminders that the case remained unsolved. She continued printing new flyers, distributing them to truck stops, shopping centers, and mailing them to towns across Texas and neighboring states, hoping someone, somewhere might recognize Rachel or remember seeing her silver Toyota Corolla. Meanwhile, her health deteriorated visibly. Sleepless nights and constant stress left her hair completely gray, her face lined beyond her years. Doctors diagnosed her with hypertension and chronic anxiety, urging her to rest and consider therapy. But Margaret refused to slow down, saying simply, "If I stop, everyone will forget her." Her husband Harold kept working at his small construction business to support the family, but each time he returned home to find his wife hunched over the computer surrounded by maps and flyers, he could only embrace her silently, helpless against the grief that had become their constant companion. Rachel's sister Emma, who had been 16 when Rachel vanished, graduated high school and left for college, but carried a burden of survivor's guilt that affected her relationships and studies. "I keep thinking if I had just gotten a ride home with someone else that day instead of waiting for her, she might still be here," she confided to a close friend. Emma eventually transferred to a university closer to home, unable to bear being far from her parents during their ongoing ordeal. In the community, mentioning Rachel's name became an increasingly awkward subject. Some neighbors still offered prayers during holidays or on the anniversary of her disappearance, but most fell silent on the topic, afraid to reopen wounds that clearly had never healed. Children growing up during those years knew Rachel only through the faded posters and occasional whispered conversations between adults, like a local ghost story, but one too painful to share openly. Pinewood continued functioning. Schools operated, businesses opened and closed, seasons changed. But beneath that veneer of normality lay a void that could never be filled. 7 years passed in that strange limbo, no explanations, no significant leads, nothing but lingering questions. For the Sutton family, every morning began with the same unspoken thought: where's Rachel? And as each night fell, the only answer was the cold silence that had become their unwanted companion through those endless years. In the summer of 2013, East Texas experienced a historic drought that shattered records dating back to the Dust Bowl. The fields around Pinewood turned brittle and brown despite farmers' desperate irrigation efforts, and the Red River, which had always defined the northern boundary of the county, receded dramatically, revealing expanses of cracked riverbed that hadn't been exposed in living memory. Residents observed this environmental crisis with mounting concern, recognizing it as both an agricultural emergency and an alarming sign of climate change. Yet this natural disaster unexpectedly delivered a discovery that would shatter the town's uneasy equilibrium. On a scorching August morning, brothers Mason and Ethan Wilkins took their small fishing boat out on what remained of the river, hoping to catch something in the deeper channels that still held water. As lifetime residents who knew every bend of the Red River, they navigated to a spot near an old abandoned railroad bridge, where the water cut deep against a limestone bank. While moving along a newly exposed sandbar, Mason spotted something reflective glinting in the harsh sunlight. At first, he thought it might be discarded metal or perhaps an old refrigerator dumped illegally years ago. But as they maneuvered closer, the unmistakable shape of a car's roof emerged from the mud. That's a car, Ethan," he stammered, his voice breaking the morning stillness. "There's a whole damn car down there." They immediately called the Pinewood Sheriff's Department. Within an hour, the area was cordoned off with yellow tape, and deputies arrived with the county dive team. Under the blistering August sun, curious onlookers began gathering along the riverbank, watching as officers in black wetsuits waded into the shallow water surrounding the partially submerged vehicle. Recovering the car proved challenging. Years of river silt had essentially cemented it in place, with only the roof and part of the trunk visible above the mud. Divers attached cables to the frame while a tow truck positioned on the nearest accessible bank prepared to pull it free. When the car was finally extracted, water and mud cascading from its windows, officers quickly covered it with a blue tarp. But whispers spread rapidly through the crowd. It was a silver sedan, heavily rusted and water-damaged, but recognizable as a Toyota. Hours later, as evening approached, Sheriff James Caldwell confirmed what many had already suspected: the license plate matched Rachel Sutton's Toyota Corolla, missing since June 2006. The news raced through Pinewood like an electrical current. The town, which had gradually allowed the case to fade from daily conversation, was suddenly consumed by it once again. The Sutton family was contacted immediately, and upon arriving at the scene, Margaret Sutton collapsed at the sight of the mud-covered vehicle being loaded onto a flatbed truck. Harold supported his wife as she wept, 7 years of uncertainty crystallizing into a single, devastating moment. Rachel was no longer somewhere out there waiting to be found. She had been beneath the waters of the Red River all along. Inside the car, the forensic team discovered what they had feared but also hoped might provide answers. Human remains were found in the driver's seat, the skeleton still secured by a seat belt. They also recovered a waterlogged leather purse containing Rachel's teaching ID card, a small day planner, and a keychain with a ceramic apple, a gift from her students. A pair of women's sandals lay on the passenger floor, along with a CD case for a Dixie Chicks album. These personal items left little doubt, even before DNA testing, that they had found Rachel. The image of the rusted Corolla being lifted from the riverbed became Pinewood's new defining tragedy. Local television stations broadcast live coverage, reporters describing in hushed tones how residents stood in shocked silence, many embracing or holding hands, as the forensic team secured the car and its contents for transportation to the crime lab. "I've never seen our town so quiet," said a longtime resident to a Dallas news crew. "All you could hear was the winch creaking and people crying." The discovery opened new avenues for investigation. Forensic experts noted that the car's windows were all closed, and the driver's seat was positioned unusually far back, inconsistent with Rachel's height of 5 feet 4 inches. The front bumper showed significant damage, as if it had been struck from behind with considerable force before entering the water. These details led investigators to conclude this was unlikely to be a simple accident. The position of the vehicle in a deep section of river away from any road access points suggested deliberate action rather than an accidental drive into the water. But for the Sutton family, these theories remained secondary to the overwhelming reality that Rachel had been found. 7 years of agonizing uncertainty had ended with this grim discovery. The community held a candlelight vigil by the riverbank where the car had been recovered. Hundreds of candles illuminated the night, no longer lit in hope of Rachel's return, but in collective mourning and remembrance. Flowers, photographs, and handwritten notes piled up outside Pinewood Elementary, where her classroom had been preserved almost as a shrine, with her name still on the door. A new banner hung above the school entrance, "Forever in our hearts, Ms. Sutton," a solemn acknowledgement that the teacher so many had prayed would someday walk through those doors again was truly gone. The recovery beneath the receding waters brought answers but also reopened wounds that had never properly healed. Yet, it also marked the beginning of another journey, a quest for justice for the young woman whose smile had once brightened so many lives in Pinewood. As evidence slowly emerged, it became increasingly clear that Rachel's 2006 disappearance had never been a tragic accident but something far more sinister. After Rachel Sutton's Toyota Corolla was pulled from the Red River in the summer of 2013, the case was immediately transferred to the Texas Rangers Cold Case Unit. This elite investigative team specialized in reviving long-dormant investigations, staffed with veteran detectives skilled in applying modern forensic techniques to cases previously considered unsolvable. Among them was Ranger Alicia Dominguez, 42, renowned throughout the department for her methodical approach, unwavering determination, and remarkable ability to connect seemingly insignificant details. With 15 years of experience investigating unsolved homicides across Texas, Dominguez requested the Rachel Sutton file the moment it was reopened. For weeks, she immersed herself in the case, working from a small office at Ranger headquarters in Austin, methodically reviewing every document, photograph, and interview transcript. She didn't just focus on what had been found, she scrutinized how questions had been asked, which leads had been pursued, and which had been abandoned. The more she read, the clearer the picture became. The initial investigation had been fundamentally flawed from the outset. They rushed to judgment, Dominguez noted in her preliminary assessment. They locked onto the boyfriend theory and missed the critical window to pursue legitimate leads. Turning her attention to the physical evidence, Dominguez became fixated on the car's condition. Photographs from the recovery showed significant rear-end damage, suggesting the vehicle had been struck from behind with considerable force before entering the water. But what troubled her most was that all windows were tightly closed, and the air conditioning was still set to maximum. If this had been an accident on a sweltering June evening, she reasoned, Rachel would have had the windows down or at least the AC running. Instead, the sealed cabin with full environmental controls suggested someone else had been driving, someone who didn't feel the heat or was only in the vehicle briefly before sending it into the river. Another detail caught Dominguez's attention. The driver's seat was adjusted far back, a position that would have made it difficult for Rachel, at 5 feet 4 inches, to reach the pedals comfortably. Seat position inconsistent with victim's height, Dominguez noted. Possibly adjusted by another individual. She revisited witness statements from 2006 that had been hastily dismissed. The report of a dark pickup truck aggressively following a silver sedan near Highway 27 stood out prominently. Back then, police had noted it briefly but prioritized interviewing Tyler Delaney repeatedly instead. To Dominguez, this witness account was potentially crucial. It aligned perfectly with the time Rachel's car would have been traveling between the traffic camera location and the high school. Combined with the teenage band student's sighting of a man in a dark truck watching the school entrance around the same time, the picture grew clearer and more disturbing. This wasn't random, Dominguez concluded during her first briefing with the cold case team. Someone targeted Rachel, forced her off the road, and then deliberately disposed of her car in the river, staging it to look like an accident. The room fell silent as she laid out her theory. Many of her colleagues nodded in agreement, though some cautioned that after 7 years underwater, much of the forensic evidence would be severely degraded, making conclusive proof difficult to establish. Dominguez acknowledged the challenge but remained undeterred. "We can't change what happened in 2006, she responded firmly. "But we have technologies and techniques now that didn't exist then. Time doesn't erase everything." The team began re-examining all available evidence. Rachel's recovered personal items, her purse, day planner, and clothing fragments, were sent to the state's advanced forensic lab for DNA analysis. The skeleton underwent comprehensive examination for any signs of premortem injuries that might indicate a struggle. Soil and debris from inside the car were carefully collected, hoping to find stray hairs, fibers, or DNA traces that might have survived the years underwater. Dominguez pushed for the application of forensic genealogy, a revolutionary technique that had recently begun solving decades-old cold cases across the country. For the Sutton family, the transfer of Rachel's case to the Texas Rangers represented the first real hope after years of painful silence. Margaret Sutton, visibly aged beyond her years by nearly a decade of grief and uncertainty, wept when Ranger Dominguez personally visited their home to explain the new investigation. Finally, Margaret whispered, clutching Harold's hand tightly. "Someone who believes this wasn't just some accident." Emma, now a young woman who had lived nearly half her life in the shadow of her sister's disappearance, regarded Dominguez with cautious hope. "Do you really think you can find out what happened after all this time?" "I can't promise results," Dominguez answered honestly. "But I can promise that your sister's case will get the attention it deserved from the beginning." To Ranger Alicia Dominguez, this wasn't merely another file to clear from her desk. It represented a fundamental duty, to bring truth to a family that had lived too long without it and justice to a young woman who had been denied it for 7 years. She believed with absolute conviction that with patience, modern science, and relentless investigation, Rachel Sutton's story could finally be told truthfully, just as her silver car had finally emerged from the dark waters of the Red River that August day. From that moment forward, Rachel's case was no longer a forgotten tragedy but a homicide investigation determined to uncover the truth that had been hidden for far too long. In 2015, as the investigation into Rachel Sutton's death entered its 9th year, Ranger Alicia Dominguez and the Texas Rangers Cold Case Unit committed to a bold new approach, forensic genealogy. This DNA-based technique, which analyzes family connections through genetic markers, had begun revolutionizing cold case investigations across the country, most famously identifying the Golden State Killer after more than 40 years. Dominguez knew that with limited physical evidence remaining after 7 years underwater, this cutting-edge science might represent their last, best hope of identifying Rachel's killer. The team selected samples from the driver's seat upholstery and the steering wheel, where trace DNA might have been protected from complete degradation by the river water's cold temperature at depth. The Texas Department of Public Safety's forensic laboratory spent months extracting and amplifying these severely compromised DNA samples. Using advanced techniques unavailable in 2006, they managed to construct a partial genetic profile, enough to upload to public genealogy databases where millions of Americans voluntarily shared their DNA to research family histories or find distant relatives. In March 2015, the first results arrived: no direct matches in the Cody's criminal database, but significant connections to multiple individuals with the surname Blackwood, scattered across East Texas and Louisiana. Genealogists working with the Rangers meticulously traced family trees, combing through birth certificates, marriage records, and census data going back generations. After weeks of painstaking work, a name emerged at the center of these connections: Robert Blackwood, 52, a Pinewood resident who owned the town's only auto body shop, just 3 blocks from Pinewood Elementary School. When the report reached the Cold Case Unit, Dominguez immediately recognized the significance. The original case files mentioned Blackwood only peripherally. He had volunteered during the initial searches for Rachel and had been interviewed briefly as part of the canvassing of local business owners. In 2006, police had never considered him a suspect. Blackwood had maintained the perfect cover, a respected local businessman who sponsored Little League teams and donated to the annual Christmas toy drive. He was known throughout Pinewood as a pillar of the community who had served 2 terms on the town council. Dominguez and her team dug deeper, uncovering troubling details in Blackwood's past that had never been connected to Rachel's case. In 1997, a female employee at his auto shop had quit suddenly, moving to Houston without explanation. When contacted by rangers, she reluctantly revealed that Blackwood had made increasingly inappropriate advances and once followed her home, though no formal complaint had ever been filed. In 2003, he had been arrested for a bar fight in neighboring Rayburn County, where he had violently confronted a man dating his ex-girlfriend. He paid a fine, attended anger management classes, and the incident was largely forgotten. To most Pinewood residents, these were isolated incidents that didn't tarnish Blackwood's reputation as a successful businessman and community leader. Forensic genealogists narrowed their focus, comparing Blackwood's likely genetic profile against the DNA recovered from Rachel's car. The match probability was calculated at 99.7%, virtually certain that either Blackwood or an extremely close male relative had left biological traces in the vehicle. After 9 years, we have a name, Dominguez announced in a closed briefing with her team. Now we need to build an airtight case. The Sutton family, informed of this breakthrough under strict confidentiality, experienced a complex storm of emotions. Margaret gasped audibly. Robert Blackwood? The man who offered a reward for information about Rachel? The realization that someone so familiar, who had stood beside them at vigils and expressed sympathy for their loss, could potentially be responsible left the family reeling. Over the following months, the Rangers quietly but thoroughly investigated every aspect of Blackwood's life. They discovered that during the week of Rachel's disappearance, Blackwood had abruptly canceled several appointments, claiming a family emergency in Louisiana. A former employee recalled that when Blackwood returned to work, he had bandages on his hands, which he explained were from helping his brother-in-law with home renovations. The Rangers also learned that Blackwood had serviced Rachel's Toyota Corolla twice in the months before her disappearance, once for a brake inspection and once to repair a dent in the passenger door. Former shop employees remembered that Blackwood had taken particular interest in Rachel, insisting on handling her car personally rather than assigning it to other mechanics. Dominguez knew they were closing in, but genealogical DNA wasn't enough for an arrest warrant. They needed a direct match to Blackwood himself. Rather than rushing and potentially compromising the case, Dominguez played a patient game, monitoring Blackwood, waiting for an opportunity to legally collect his DNA from discarded items like coffee cups or cigarette butts. In 2015, with Robert Blackwood's name rising from the shadows, hope rekindled in Pinewood. After 9 years of dead ends and faded memories, a new path forward had emerged. In Ranger Dominguez's determined eyes, this case was no longer just an assignment but a sacred trust, to unmask the darkness hiding behind the respectable face of a man the town had welcomed into its heart without question. Robert Blackwood, born in 1963, grew up in a small Louisiana parish before moving to Pinewood in the early 1990s. He established Blackwood's Auto Body and Repair on Main Street, turning a dilapidated former gas station into a thriving business that served the entire county. Few residents ever left Pinewood for car repairs once Blackwood arrived, as his prices were fair and his work reliable. For many in Pinewood, Blackwood was more than just a mechanic. He was the man who sponsored the Little League team when the previous backer pulled out, who offered free vehicle inspections to senior citizens on fixed incomes, and who organized the annual Main Street Christmas Parade. With his salt-and-pepper hair, stocky build, and firm handshake, Blackwood projected an image of small-town trustworthiness and reliability. When Rachel Sutton vanished in 2006, Blackwood was among the first business owners to post her missing person flyer prominently in his shop window. He donated a $5,000 reward for information leading to her whereabouts and provided free oil changes to volunteers who used their personal vehicles during the search efforts. During community vigils, he stood solemnly with other concerned citizens, his weathered mechanic's hands holding a candle, his face appropriately grave. But as Rangers investigating the cold case discovered, Blackwood had crafted this public persona carefully over decades, concealing troubling behaviors beneath his community-minded exterior. In 1997, a young woman who briefly worked as his receptionist abruptly quit and moved away. When contacted by Ranger Dominguez in 2015, she hesitantly revealed that Blackwood had made her increasingly uncomfortable with unwanted attention, once following her home after work, claiming he was just making sure she got there safely. In 2003, Blackwood was arrested after a violent altercation at a bar in neighboring Rayburn County when he confronted a man dating his former girlfriend. The incident resulted in a broken nose and 3 fractured ribs for the victim, though Blackwood later claimed he had been provoked. He paid a fine, attended court-mandated anger management classes, and the matter was considered resolved. To most in Pinewood, these were isolated incidents that never seriously tarnished his standing as a respected business owner. The direct connection to Rachel Sutton emerged through vehicle service records. Blackwood's shop had serviced Rachel's Toyota Corolla twice in the months before her disappearance, once for a routine brake check and once to repair a dent in the passenger door. Former employees remembered that Blackwood had personally handled both appointments, something unusual as he typically delegated routine maintenance to his mechanics. During the second visit, just 3 weeks before Rachel disappeared, a former shop assistant recalled Blackwood engaging Rachel in extended conversation, asking about her teaching job and commenting on photos of her students that she kept in her wallet. The assistant noted that while nothing seemed overtly inappropriate, Blackwood's attention seemed unusually focused. After Rachel left, Blackwood mentioned that she reminded him of someone he once knew. More disturbing was a detail uncovered when Rangers interviewed Rachel's close friend and fellow teacher, Melissa Garza. 6 weeks before her disappearance, Rachel had mentioned feeling uneasy after receiving a voicemail from the mechanic about scheduling another service that she hadn't requested. She thought it was odd, Melissa told investigators. She said her car was running fine, and she'd just had it checked. Rachel had chosen not to return the call, deciding to use a different shop in the future. In 2006, no one connected these scattered pieces: a mechanic's unusual attention, an unrequested service call, Rachel's vague discomfort. But in 2015, they formed a disturbing pattern for Ranger Dominguez and her team. Blackwood had access to Rachel's car, knew her routine from conversations during service appointments, and had exhibited concerning behavior toward women in the past. What most alarmed the Rangers was how Blackwood had positioned himself throughout the investigation and subsequent years, not hiding in the shadows, but standing in plain sight. He participated in searches, attended memorials, and offered support to the Sutton family, all while knowing exactly what had happened to their daughter. His presence at these events wasn't just brazen. In Dominguez's assessment, it revealed a disturbing need to remain connected to his crime, to witness its impact firsthand. To Pinewood residents, Blackwood was a cornerstone of the community, the reliable mechanic, the generous donor, the friendly neighbor. But through the investigative lens of the Texas Rangers, he emerged as someone who had spent decades crafting a public image that allowed his darker impulses to remain hidden. Someone who understood that in small towns, the most effective camouflage is often active community involvement. When Robert Blackwood's name officially appeared in Texas Rangers reports as a suspect in Rachel Sutton's death, Pinewood faced a reality few communities ever have to confront: that the monster they feared might be hiding among strangers had instead been sitting beside them at church potlucks and town council meetings for years. In early 2016, after months of methodical surveillance, Ranger Alicia Dominguez determined it was time to collect a direct DNA sample from Robert Blackwood. The genealogical evidence had identified him with near certainty, and mounting circumstantial evidence strengthened their case, but for an arrest warrant, prosecutors needed Blackwood's personal DNA to match the crime scene evidence definitively. Dominguez knew Blackwood would never provide a sample voluntarily. Collecting it covertly from items he discarded in public spaces became their only legal and practical option. On a cool February morning, as Blackwood made his daily stop at Pinewood Diner for coffee and breakfast, 2 plainclothes Rangers waited patiently in an unmarked vehicle across the street. When Blackwood left the diner, they entered casually, retrieving the coffee cup and napkin he'd left behind. Both items were carefully sealed in evidence bags and rushed to the State Forensic Laboratory in Austin. With years of experience, Dominguez prepared herself for a long wait. DNA analysis could take weeks, even months for complex cases. She focused on reviewing and strengthening other aspects of the investigation, ensuring their case would be irrefutable when the moment for action arrived. Just 17 days later, the report landed on her desk. The DNA profile extracted from Blackwood's discarded coffee cup matched 100% with the biological traces recovered from Rachel's Toyota Corolla's steering wheel and driver's seat upholstery. The clinical language of the report, match confirmed with 9,999% certainty, belied the emotional weight of the moment. Dominguez sat alone in her office, staring at those words, feeling a complex mixture of vindication, relief, and renewed determination. She knew this moment would change everything, not just for the case, but for the entire town of Pinewood. That afternoon, Dominguez met with the district attorney's office. She methodically presented their evidence chain, the initial genealogical findings, the suspicious rear-end damage to Rachel's car, the inconsistent driver's seat position, witness statements about a dark truck following a silver sedan, and finally, the definitive DNA match placing Blackwood in Rachel's vehicle at a time he had never admitted to being there. "We have more than enough for an arrest warrant," the lead prosecutor concluded after reviewing the evidence. "This is as solid as cold cases get." That night, Dominguez couldn't sleep. At her kitchen table, surrounded by case notes, she studied Rachel's photograph, her bright smile captured at a school function months before her disappearance. She thought of Rachel Sutton, a mother who had lived with unbearable uncertainty for nearly a decade, and of Pinewood, a community that had placed its trust in a man who had violated that trust in the most profound way possible. "Tomorrow, everything changes," she whispered to herself. In the formal arrest warrant application, Dominguez wrote, "The DNA match between Robert Blackwood and biological evidence recovered from the victim's vehicle is conclusive beyond any reasonable scientific doubt." She detailed witness accounts that placed a vehicle matching Blackwood's dark pickup truck following Rachel's Corolla on the night she vanished, Rachel's documented unease about his attention, and the suspicious injuries to his hands observed days after her disappearance. When the warrant reached District Judge Eleanor Watkins on March 5, 2016, she signed it immediately, adding a note authorizing a tactical arrest given the severity of the charges. News of the impending arrest was kept strictly confidential, with only a small circle of law enforcement officials informed to prevent any possibility of leaks reaching Blackwood. While the suspect continued his daily routine, opening his shop each morning, attending his usual Rotary Club lunch on Wednesdays, coaching Little League practice, Ranger Dominguez coordinated with a specially trained arrest team. She wanted no risks, no opportunities for Blackwood to destroy evidence or, worse, harm himself or others when confronted. For weeks, they meticulously monitored Blackwood's movements. His home on Cypress Street was under 24-hour surveillance. His regular routes through town were mapped in detail. Even his grocery shopping habits and morning coffee ritual were documented and analyzed. Everything was prepared with extraordinary care, as Dominguez knew this wasn't merely an arrest, it was the culmination of a decade-long journey toward justice for a family that had suffered too long without answers. Holding the signed warrant in her hands, Dominguez felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Standing on the steps of the county courthouse, she took a deep breath of the crisp March air and thought silently, "Rachel, we're finally bringing you justice." Thus, after a decade of silence, what had remained hidden behind Robert Blackwood's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. From a microscopic DNA trace in a waterlogged car to an irrefutable match in 2016, the journey proved that truth, though it might remain buried for years, could not be erased completely. For Ranger Alicia Dominguez, this breakthrough represented more than solving a case, it was the final chapter in a story that had haunted Pinewood for too long. The town was about to confront the devastating reality that Rachel Sutton's killer was not some mysterious outsider but the trusted neighbor who had stood beside them at her candlelight vigils. On March 15, 2016, a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning in Pinewood was transformed into a moment that would be seared into the town's collective memory forever. At 6:05 a.m., as the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky, a convoy of unmarked vehicles and Texas Ranger SUVs silently converged on Cypress Street. Robert Blackwood's two-story brick home, with its manicured lawn and American flag fluttering from the porch, was surrounded by armed officers moving with practiced precision. Ranger Alicia Dominguez stood at the command position, radio in hand, her face set with determination. After years of methodical investigation, the moment of reckoning had arrived. When her voice came through the tactical radio, "All units in position, execute the warrant," the neighborhood erupted into controlled chaos. A loudspeaker cut through the morning stillness. "Robert Blackwood, this is the Texas Rangers. We have a warrant for your arrest. Exit your front door with your hands visible." The sudden noise awakened neighbors, lights flickering on in surrounding homes as curious and alarmed faces appeared at windows. 4 minutes later, after repeated announcements, Blackwood's front door opened. He emerged wearing flannel pajama pants and a gray t-shirt, blinking in confusion at the floodlights illuminating his porch. His expression changed from bewilderment to something unreadable as officers approached with weapons drawn. He was handcuffed without resistance, his only words a muttered, "This is a mistake." Whispers of shock rippled through the gathering crowd as neighbors emerged onto their lawns. An elderly woman clutched her robe closed at her throat, trembling visibly. "My God, it's Bob," she gasped. "He fixed my car just last week." A middle-aged man shook his head in disbelief. "Blackwood? No way. He coached my son's baseball team." Blackwood himself remained stone-faced as he was led to a waiting vehicle, his eyes fixed on the ground, avoiding the stares of his neighbors. The image of Pinewood's respected business owner and community leader in handcuffs shattered the town's understanding of itself in an instant. Local and regional news crews, tipped off minutes earlier, captured the scene, Blackwood being placed in the back of a Texas Ranger vehicle, his slumped shoulders and downcast eyes a stark contrast to his usual confident demeanor. The news spread through Pinewood with unprecedented speed. Within hours, the entire town buzzed with disbelief and growing horror. At the Sutton home, when Ranger Dominguez's official call came through, Margaret collapsed into a chair, decades of pain breaking through in deep, racking sobs. "Bob Blackwood," she kept repeating, her voice hollow with shock. "He came to our house. He offered rewards. He prayed with us." Harold stood behind his wife, hands gripping her shoulders, his weathered face revealing a complex mixture of grief, rage, and vindication. Emma Sutton, now a young woman in her mid-20s who had lived most of her life in the shadow of her sister's disappearance, stared at her parents in stunned silence before finally whispering, "He was hiding in plain sight all this time." Family members gathered quickly, embracing through tears that represented not just continued sorrow but a profound, almost overwhelming release, the first step toward closure after an unimaginable decade-long journey. That afternoon, the Texas Department of Public Safety held a press conference at the Pinewood Community Center. The room overflowed with journalists, cameras positioned for the best angles, microphones clustered on the podium. Major Samuel Richardson of the Texas Rangers stepped forward, his face solemn but his voice steady and clear. "Today, we announce that Robert Blackwood, age 52, a resident and business owner in Pinewood, has been arrested and charged with the 2006 kidnapping and murder of Rachel Sutton," he stated. "This was not an accident, as once theorized. Our investigation has uncovered evidence of a deliberate, premeditated homicide followed by extensive efforts to conceal the crime." The room erupted with questions, reporters calling out and raising hands. Richardson continued, "DNA evidence conclusively places Blackwood in the victim's vehicle. Witness statements and forensic analysis paint a clear picture of his involvement. After 10 years, we believe justice for Rachel Sutton is finally within reach." When a reporter asked about motive, Richardson replied carefully, "The investigation is ongoing, but evidence suggests Blackwood developed an obsession with Ms. Sutton after servicing her vehicle. When she rejected his advances, we believe he acted with deliberate malice." Outside the community center, residents gathered with flowers and candles, both to honor Rachel's memory and to witness this pivotal moment in their town's history. A teacher who had worked alongside Rachel whispered to those nearby, "I used to bring my car to him every 3 months. He always seemed so normal, so kind." An older man shook his head slowly. "He sat on the town council with me for 4 years. Who could have imagined?" The shock of betrayal rippled through every conversation. Blackwood had been transported to the state detention center, where he was held without bail pending arraignment. Media described him as expressionless during booking, refusing to answer questions from investigators or acknowledge the charges against him. For Ranger Alicia Dominguez, the day represented the culmination of years of persistence. Standing at the back of the press conference, she watched Margaret and Harold Sutton sitting in the front row, their hands clasped tightly together, both nodding slightly in her direction, a silent acknowledgement of gratitude too profound for words. Dominguez understood that justice couldn't erase their loss, but it could provide the answers they had sought for so long, answers that might finally allow them to move forward with their lives. That evening, national news outlets reported, cold case breakthrough in Texas, small-town business owner arrested for 2006 murder of beloved teacher. Pinewood found itself under an unwanted spotlight, not for its annual rodeo or peach festival, but for harboring a killer in its midst for a decade. The man they had trusted with their vehicles, their children's baseball games, and their community leadership had been unmasked as a predator. Questions flooded every conversation. How had he hidden his true nature so effectively? Were there other victims who had never been discovered? And most hauntingly, how could someone commit such a terrible act and then continue living among them, watching their grief unfold year after year? Specific answers awaited the trial, but the Ranger's message was unequivocal. Robert Blackwood had deliberately taken Rachel Sutton's life and then spent a decade pretending to mourn her alongside the very community he had traumatized. For the Sutton family, the arrest represented the validation they had desperately sought, official confirmation that Rachel hadn't simply vanished or died in a tragic accident, but had been taken from them by calculated violence. The truth, though devastating, was finally emerging from 10 years of darkness. Immediately following Major Richardson's press conference, Pinewood fractured into opposing camps, the division visible on street corners, in the aisles of Sullivan's Grocery, at the counter of the Pinewood Diner, and especially on social media. Every conversation revolved around one name, Robert Blackwood. For many residents, his arrest was simply incomprehensible. "I've known Bob for 20 years, said Frank Delgado, whose auto parts store had supplied Blackwood's shop, speaking to a Dallas news reporter. He helped rebuild the Little League dugouts after the tornado in '09. He volunteered at the food bank every Thanksgiving. How could someone like that be a murderer?" This sentiment quickly gained traction. Some argued that the Ranger's evidence, DNA in Rachel's car, had reasonable explanations. Of course his DNA was in her car, a former employee posted on Facebook. He serviced her vehicle. That doesn't make him a killer. This group believed law enforcement, under pressure to solve a decade-old case that had haunted the region, had targeted Blackwood as a convenient scapegoat. Conversely, others in the community expressed little surprise at the revelation. They spoke of subtle warning signs they had dismissed over the years, the intensity in Blackwood's gaze when speaking to young women, his occasional flashes of temper when challenged at town meetings, his tendency to insert himself into situations where he could position himself as a hero or benefactor. There was always something calculated about his generosity, a middle-aged teacher remarked quietly outside the high school. Like he was performing kindness rather than feeling it. A young woman who had worked briefly at his shop recalled uncomfortable moments when Blackwood stood too close or found reasons to touch her shoulder or arm, nothing overtly inappropriate, but enough to create a persistent unease she had never fully articulated until now. Social media became the primary battleground where these competing narratives clashed. On the Pinewood community Facebook page, heated debates unfolded hourly. One faction posted photos of Blackwood at charity events, writing captions like, "Does this look like a killer to you? The Rangers have made a terrible mistake." Others countered with compilations of true crime cases featuring perpetrators who had masterfully hidden behind respectable facades, noting, "The friendliest neighbor can hide the darkest secrets." Comments accumulated by the hundreds, drawing in participants ranging from elderly residents who barely understood the platform to teenagers who knew Rachel Sutton only as a local legend. Religious leaders found themselves caught in the crossfire. Pastor Mitchell of First Baptist Church, where Blackwood had occasionally attended, addressed his congregation on the Sunday following the arrest. "We pray for Rachel and for the Sutton family, but we also pray for truth and justice to prevail. Let us not rush to judgment in either direction until all facts are known through proper legal channels." Though intended as a calming message, his words satisfied neither side. Half the congregation nodded in solemn agreement while others shifted uncomfortably, interpreting the statement as either too lenient toward Blackwood or too accepting of the charges against him. At Main Street Coffee, which Blackwood had frequented every morning for years, the atmosphere grew tense when the owner removed a photograph of Blackwood from the local business leader's wall display. This action angered his supporters, who saw it as presuming guilt before trial, while others threatened to boycott the cafe if the photo remained, viewing its presence as disrespectful to Rachel's memory. For the Sutton family, these divisions created additional pain atop their already unbearable burden. Linda Sutton broke down during a brief encounter with reporters outside their home when asked about community members defending Blackwood. "How can they still defend him when the evidence is so clear?" she asked through tears. "It feels like losing Rachel all over again, having people choose him over justice for our daughter." Harold Sutton largely avoided public comment, but during one rare interview, he stated simply, "DNA doesn't lie." People who still believe in Blackwood's innocence are denying science and protecting a monster. As the case moved toward trial, Pinewood remained deeply divided. One faction clung to the image of the generous mechanic who had sponsored community events and helped neighbors in need. The other saw a calculated predator who had hidden behind a carefully constructed facade for decades. Every church service, school event, and town gathering became a potential flashpoint for renewed debate. Lifelong friendships fractured over disagreements about Blackwood's guilt or innocence. Families found themselves unable to discuss the case at dinner tables without voices rising and tensions flaring. Amid this turmoil, Rachel Sutton's name echoed throughout Pinewood once again, no longer as the young teacher who had vanished without explanation a decade earlier, but as a symbol of a truth so painful it threatened to tear apart the community's very foundation. In spring 2016, as bluebonnets painted the roadsides around Pinewood with vibrant color, the air remained heavy with anticipation of Robert Blackwood's upcoming trial. The Sutton family's modest home, quiet and withdrawn for a decade, became the gathering place for supportive friends, extended family, and occasionally, carefully vetted media representatives. Margaret Sutton, her face etched with the unmistakable marks of 10 years of grief, sat in her favorite chair by the window, a framed photograph of Rachel on the side table beside her. When asked how she felt after Blackwood's arrest, she closed her eyes briefly before answering. "I can't call this closure," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "Nothing can replace what we've lost. But at least now we know Rachel hasn't been forgotten. At least now there's a chance for justice." Tears slipped down her cheeks, not the desperate sobs of earlier years, but the quieter tears of someone who had lived with sorrow for so long it had become a familiar companion. Harold Sutton, standing behind his wife's chair with a protective hand on her shoulder, had aged visibly since their daughter's disappearance, his once dark hair now completely gray, deep lines carved around his eyes and mouth. "For 10 years, I've woken up every morning with the same first thought, where's Rachel? Now we know. It doesn't make it easier, but at least it's an answer." Emma Sutton, now 26, had lived nearly half her life in the shadow of her sister's disappearance. The once carefree teenager was now a serious young woman pursuing a degree in criminal justice, inspired by Ranger Dominguez's dedication to her sister's case. When she spoke about Blackwood, her voice carried a controlled anger that belied her calm exterior. He sat at community fundraisers for the search. He offered rewards. He looked my parents in the eye year after year, knowing exactly what he'd done to Rachel. She paused, composing herself. "What matters now is that he's not free to hurt anyone else. My sister deserves justice, no matter how long it took to come." At the final press briefing before the case transferred to the prosecution team for trial preparation, Ranger Alicia Dominguez spoke briefly but powerfully to the assembled media. "Time doesn't erase evidence completely. Justice may arrive late, but it will arrive. The truth cannot remain buried forever, no matter how deeply someone tries to hide it." Her words resonated throughout the room, creating a moment of reflective silence among normally vocal reporters. For Dominguez, the Rachel Sutton case represented more than another file successfully closed. It validated her fundamental belief that no victim should ever be forgotten, no matter how cold the trail might become. She had dedicated nearly 4 years to pursuing this truth, and now, seeing the Sutton family begin to find some measure of peace, she felt her work had meaning beyond professional accomplishment. It had restored a small measure of balance to a world tilted by senseless violence a decade earlier. Meanwhile, Pinewood continued struggling with the aftermath of Blackwood's arrest. The community had to confront the bitter reality that the perpetrator of a crime that had haunted the town for 10 years was someone who had lived among them, greeted them each morning at his shop, and served alongside them on community projects. Blackwood's auto body and repair remained closed, its sign removed, leaving only faded paint outlines on the brick facade. The building stood empty, a daily reminder of betrayal that many residents found difficult to pass. Some neighbors admitted feeling profound guilt for never noticing warning signs. "He once offered to teach my daughter to drive when she got her learner's permit," a father confessed during a town hall meeting organized to help the community process their collective trauma. "I thanked him for it. The thought of what could have happened keeps me awake at night." Conversations at Sullivan's Grocery, the Pinewood Diner, and church gatherings gradually shifted from debates about Blackwood's guilt to deeper questions about community trust, vigilance, and healing. Social media discussions, once filled with argumentative defenses or accusations, slowly evolved into reflections on how Pinewood could move forward and support the Sutton family. National newspapers described the case as a powerful example of how forensic genealogy and persistent investigation could solve cases once considered impossible to crack. Pinewood, previously known to few outside East Texas, became synonymous with one of the decade's most noteworthy cold case resolutions. But behind the media spotlight, the residents of Pinewood and the Sutton family had to live with the tragedy's enduring legacy. Margaret admitted she no longer had the emotional strength to return to community volunteer work, instead finding solace in tending a memorial garden planted with Rachel's favorite flowers. Harold continued working his construction business, finding that physical labor offered some relief from the constant weight of grief. Emma remained in Pinewood despite numerous opportunities to leave, explaining simply, "This is where Rachel's memory lives strongest. I need to be here to see this through." At a memorial service held at Pinewood Elementary following Blackwood's arrest, hundreds gathered in the gymnasium where Rachel had once organized field day activities for her third graders. They placed white roses beside a portrait of the young teacher, reading aloud memories written by former students and colleagues. Many wept openly as the school principal said, "Rachel wasn't just a victim in a tragic case. She was our friend, our colleague, our teacher, and she will never be forgotten in these halls." For Ranger Dominguez, with the investigation complete and the case awaiting trial, she found herself drawn back to the spot on the Red River where Rachel's car had been recovered 3 years earlier. Standing on the bank, watching the water flow past, she felt both professional satisfaction and a lingering melancholy. "Some secrets take time to surface," she murmured to herself. "But with enough patience and determination, the truth always finds its way to light." Robert Blackwood's trial was scheduled for late 2016. Prosecutors assembled an extensive case, presenting DNA evidence, witness accounts, and forensic analysis proving Blackwood had followed Rachel's car that June evening, forced her off the road, and then deliberately disposed of her vehicle in the Red River to conceal his crime. Throughout pre-trial hearings, Blackwood maintained his innocence, his attorney claiming the DNA evidence was compromised by years underwater and could have been deposited during legitimate vehicle servicing. But few in the courtroom, from jurors to observers, seemed convinced by these arguments as the mountain of evidence continued to grow. For the Sutton family and most of Pinewood, the truth was finally clear: Robert Blackwood was the man who had stolen a beloved daughter and teacher from their midst, leaving a void that 10 years of searching and grieving could never fill. Pinewood faced a long journey toward healing. Trust, once shattered, proved difficult to rebuild. The community implemented new safety education programs in schools. Churches held workshops on recognizing warning signs of predatory behavior. The town council established a scholarship in Rachel's name for students pursuing teaching careers. The Sutton family, while carrying their private grief, participated in these efforts, seeing them as ways for Rachel's legacy to continue making a positive difference in others' lives. "She would have wanted that," Margaret often said. She always believed in making the world better, one small action at a time. Rachel Sutton's story transcended a mere true crime case. It served as a powerful reminder that even in seemingly safe communities, danger can hide behind the most respectable facades. It demonstrated that with advances in forensic science, persistent investigation, and unwavering determination, truth can emerge even after a decade of darkness. As dusk settled over Pinewood one evening, the elementary school bell rang out across the quiet streets, a tradition started in Rachel's memory. Residents paused in their activities, many lighting candles in windows, affirming that Rachel Sutton would never be forgotten and that her story would continue to inspire vigilance, compassion, and the relentless pursuit of justice. An elderly teacher who had mentored Rachel during her first year at Pinewood Elementary summed it up perfectly as she stood watching the sun set behind the school building. The truth may remain hidden for years, but like a river that cannot be permanently dammed, it will eventually find its way into the light. The flickering candles across town reminded everyone that though justice had arrived late for Rachel Sutton, it had arrived, proving that no matter how perfect the disguise or how much time passes, truth eventually prevails. The trial of Robert Blackwood began in September 2016 at the Rayburn County Courthouse. The historic building, with its imposing limestone columns and oak-paneled courtroom, had witnessed countless proceedings over its century-long existence, but few had drawn the attention that now descended upon the small East Texas town. National media outlets established temporary headquarters in local motels, satellite trucks lined the courthouse square, and spectators arrived before dawn to secure seats in the gallery. Inside the courtroom, the Sutton family sat in the front row, directly behind the prosecution table. Margaret and Harold maintained composed expressions despite the emotional weight of the proceedings, their hands often intertwined for mutual support. Emma sat beside them, her notebook open, recording every detail with the methodical precision she had developed during her criminal justice studies. Behind them, rows of Pinewood residents filled the gallery, teachers who had worked alongside Rachel, former students now in college, neighbors who had joined the search parties a decade earlier. State Prosecutor Victoria Lawson, known for her meticulous preparation and calm demeanor, opened with a powerful statement that immediately captured the jury's attention. This case is about a beloved young teacher whose life was stolen on a summer evening in 2006, she began, her voice steady and clear. But it's also about the decade of deception that followed, a man who murdered Rachel Sutton and then stood beside her grieving family year after year, pretending to share their pain while knowing exactly what had happened to their daughter. Lawson methodically laid out the state's case. Blackwood had developed an obsession with Rachel after servicing her car, made unwanted advances that she rejected, then followed her on the evening of June 8, 2006. Using his larger vehicle, he forced her off the isolated stretch of Highway 27, overpowered her, and then deliberately drove her car into the Red River to stage an accident, counting on the river's depths to hide his crime indefinitely. The defendant believed water would wash away his sins, Lawson told the jury. But even after a decade underwater, science revealed the truth he tried to hide. The defense, led by attorney James Merritt, countered with claims that the Rangers had rushed to judgment after years of pressure to solve the high-profile case. Mr. Blackwood was an easy target, visible in the community and someone who had legitimate reason to have been in contact with Rachel's vehicle, Merritt argued. The DNA evidence proves nothing more than that he serviced her car, which everyone already knew. Over the following 3 weeks, the courtroom became a stage for the scientific and personal evidence that had accumulated over a decade. Forensic experts explained how DNA could survive years underwater in protected areas of a vehicle. Rangers detailed the methodical genealogical investigation that had finally identified Blackwood. Former employees from his auto shop testified about his unusual interest in Rachel and his unexplained absences and injuries around the time of her disappearance. Perhaps the most powerful testimony came from unexpected sources. A woman from Louisiana testified that in 1995, while working as a waitress in Blackwood's hometown, she had experienced similar unwanted attention and following behavior from him before he moved to Texas. Though no charges had ever been filed, her account established a pattern that predated his arrival in Pinewood. The courtroom fell completely silent when Ranger Alicia Dominguez took the stand. With professional detachment, she recounted the methodical process of reopening the cold case, the breakthrough moment when genealogical DNA provided the first link to Blackwood, and the surveillance operation that secured the definitive evidence for his arrest. When asked by Prosecutor Lawson what had driven her to pursue this case so relentlessly, Dominguez glanced briefly at the Sutton family before answering. "Every victim deserves justice, no matter how much time has passed. And every family deserves answers, no matter how painful those answers might be." On the trial's 12th day, the prosecution presented its most dramatic evidence, dashboard camera footage from a county maintenance vehicle that had been driving on Highway 27 on the evening of June 8, 2006. The footage, discovered during the Rangers' exhaustive review of county archives, had never been examined during the original investigation. Though grainy and distant, it clearly showed a silver sedan followed closely by a dark pickup truck at 8:42 p.m., exactly matching the timeline of Rachel's disappearance. The vehicle maintenance worker who had been driving testified that he'd never been questioned in 2006, and only recognized the potential significance of his recording when contacted by Rangers a decade later. "If someone had asked me back then, I would have remembered seeing those vehicles," he said regretfully. "It always bothered me how close that truck was following." Throughout the proceedings, Blackwood sat motionless at the defense table, his expression unreadable. He declined to testify in his own defense, a decision that many observers interpreted as damning. His attorney presented alternative theories: perhaps Rachel had accidentally driven into the river, or another unidentified person was responsible, but these arguments seemed increasingly hollow as evidence mounted. After 16 days of testimony, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for just 4 hours before returning with their verdict. As the courtroom fell silent, the jury foreman stood and delivered their unanimous decision: guilty of first-degree murder. Blackwood showed no visible reaction as the verdict was read, his eyes fixed on the middle distance, his hands clasped loosely before him. During the sentencing phase, the Sutton family had their opportunity to address the court through victim impact statements. Margaret approached the podium first, her steps steady despite the emotion visible in her face. "For 10 years, I lived with an open wound where my heart should be," she began, her voice quiet but carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. "Every morning I woke up wondering where my daughter was, if she was suffering, if she was trying to come home to us. Every night I went to sleep with her face in my mind, praying for a miracle I knew might never come." She paused, gathering strength before continuing. "The pain of losing Rachel can never be healed. But the additional pain of not knowing, of endless questions without answers, that was a special kind of torture. Robert Blackwood didn't just take my daughter's life. He stole a decade of peace from our family by hiding the truth." Harold Sutton spoke briefly, his weathered hands gripping the podium as if for physical support. "I used to build things for a living," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I couldn't build anything to fix this. I couldn't build a world where my daughter came home safe. I couldn't build a shield to protect my wife and younger daughter from this pain." He looked directly at Blackwood for the first time. "All I can hope for now is that no other father has to stand where I'm standing, because of the man sitting there." Emma's statement was perhaps the most affecting, as she described growing up in the shadow of her sister's disappearance, how it had shaped her entire adult life and identity. "I was 16 when Rachel disappeared. I've now lived more of my life without her than with her. Every milestone, graduation, college, my first apartment, has been marked by her absence. Every achievement has been followed by the thought, Rachel would have been proud. Every holiday has an empty chair that will never be filled." She paused, composed herself, and continued with quiet intensity. "But Rachel taught me something important before she was taken from us. She taught me that even when things seem darkest, you never stop searching for light. That's why I'm studying criminal justice now. That's why I'm going to work for victims who can't speak for themselves anymore. Because of Rachel, other families might find their answers sooner than we did." Judge Eleanor Watkins, who had presided over the trial with steady impartiality, delivered the sentence after considering these statements and the jury's recommendation: life imprisonment without possibility of parole. As she announced this decision, she addressed Blackwood directly for the first time. Mr. Blackwood, beyond the horrific act you committed against Rachel Sutton, you inflicted a decade of unnecessary suffering on her family and this community by concealing your crime. You stood among those who mourned her, pretending to share their grief while knowing exactly what you had done. The court can imagine few acts more calculated or cruel. As Blackwood was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, the chapter that had begun on that sweltering June evening in 2006 finally closed. Outside on the courthouse steps, Margaret Sutton stood between her husband and daughter, facing a forest of microphones and cameras. When asked how she felt about the verdict, she considered her answer carefully. "Justice doesn't bring Rachel back to us," she said finally. "But it does mean that her story didn't end in that river. It means that the truth matters, even when it takes a decade to find. It means that Rachel wasn't forgotten." In the weeks following the trial, Pinewood began the difficult process of healing as a community. The division that had fractured the town upon Blackwood's arrest largely dissolved in the face of overwhelming evidence presented during the trial. Those who had initially defended him now struggled with their own feelings of betrayal and guilt, questioning how they could have been so thoroughly deceived by someone they considered a friend and neighbor. Blackwood's auto body and repair remained vacant for months, a painful reminder in the center of town, until the building was purchased by a community foundation. After extensive renovation, it reopened as the Rachel Sutton Memorial Center, housing both an after-school tutoring program and resources for families affected by violent crime. The transformation of this space from a source of pain to a force for positive change became symbolic of Pinewood's determination to move forward without forgetting its painful past. At Pinewood Elementary, where Rachel had taught for 5 years before her death, the school board approved a permanent memorial, a reading garden with benches, flowering trees, and a small bronze statue of a teacher and students sharing a book. Each spring, third graders planted new flowers in the garden, ensuring Rachel's presence remained vibrant and alive within the school community. For Ranger Alicia Dominguez, the Sutton case became a defining achievement in her distinguished career. She began giving presentations at law enforcement conferences about the importance of revisiting cold cases with new technologies and perspectives. Her work inspired a new generation of investigators, including Emma Sutton, who completed her criminal justice degree and went on to join the Texas Rangers herself 3 years later, specializing in cold cases and victim advocacy. The Sutton family found different paths through their grief. Margaret eventually returned to community work, establishing a support network for families of missing persons throughout East Texas. Harold dedicated himself to building wheelchair ramps for disabled veterans, finding healing through continued service to others. Their home remained a gathering place for extended family, the walls still adorned with Rachel's photographs, but now these images evoked bittersweet memories rather than open wounds. On the 10th anniversary of Blackwood's conviction, Pinewood held a community reflection service at the town square. Hundreds gathered as the sun set, holding candles that illuminated faces both familiar and new, longtime residents who had lived through the entire tragedy alongside young families who had moved to town after the case was closed. Mayor Davis, who had been a rookie police officer during the original search for Rachel, addressed the gathered crowd. "A decade ago, we learned a painful truth about someone we thought we knew," he began. "But we also learned profound truths about ourselves, about our capacity for resilience, our commitment to justice, and our ability to heal together as a community." He gestured toward the Sutton family, standing together near the small stage. From the darkest chapter in our town's history came remarkable light. The Rachel Sutton Scholarship has now helped 28 young people pursue teaching careers. The memorial center that bears her name has tutored hundreds of children. And families across Texas have found answers to their own painful questions because of investigation techniques pioneered in this case. Emma Sutton, now a respected Texas Ranger herself, stepped forward at the mayor's invitation. She wore her uniform with quiet pride, the silver star badge catching the light of the setting sun. "My sister believed that teaching was about more than textbooks and tests," she told the crowd. She believed it was about showing people how to find answers, even to the most difficult questions. In that way, Rachel is still teaching all of us. As darkness fell completely, the hundreds of candles created a sea of light across the square. Margaret and Harold Sutton, their hair now completely white but their spirits unbowed, stood hand in hand as they had through decades of joy, grief, uncertainty, and finally, resolution. The bell from Pinewood Elementary rang out across the town, a tradition started years earlier in Rachel's memory, and for 1 minute, everyone stood in perfect silence. In that moment of collective remembrance, the town acknowledged both what had been lost and what had been gained, a beloved daughter and teacher whose absence would always be felt, but also a community forever changed by the long journey toward truth and justice. The case that had once torn Pinewood apart had ultimately bound it together more strongly, creating connections that transcended the tragedy itself. As the ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, a young reporter approached Emma Sutton, asking if she had any final thoughts to share. She considered the question, looking across the square where her sister had once walked, taught, and lived. Rachel used to tell her students that the hardest questions are usually the most important ones, Emma said finally. She was right about that. The questions we faced after she disappeared were devastating, but pursuing the answers changed all of us for the better. It taught us to look more carefully at the world around us, to value truth above comfort, and to never stop searching for justice, no matter how long it takes. The Rachel Sutton case had long since passed from breaking news to local history, but its impact continued to ripple outward in ways both measurable and intangible. The forensic techniques pioneered during the investigation helped solve dozens of other cold cases across the country. The legislation inspired by the case, mandating better preservation of evidence from missing persons reports, became known informally as Rachel's Law when Texas adopted it in 2018. Beyond these concrete legacies, Rachel's story became a powerful reminder that truth has a persistence that transcends time and deception. In police academies, law schools, and forensic programs, her case was studied as evidence that justice, while sometimes delayed, need not be denied completely. And in Pinewood itself, her memory lived on not just in buildings and scholarships bearing her name, but in a community forever changed by both her life and the long shadow cast by her absence. As twilight deepened over the town square and the last candles flickered out, the bell rang once more, not in mourning but in affirmation. For Rachel Sutton, for the family that never stopped seeking answers, and for a town that had finally found its way back from the darkness into light. The story of Rachel Sutton's case offers profound reflections on contemporary American society. Perhaps most striking is how Robert Blackwood weaponized community trust and visibility. As an active business owner who sponsored Little League teams and participated in town councils, his public engagement wasn't just community service, it was calculated camouflage. This reveals a sobering truth: in communities across America, where we value knowing our neighbors and supporting local businesses, these very virtues can sometimes blind us to warning signs. Blackwood understood that in small towns especially, the most effective disguise isn't hiding in shadows but standing in the spotlight of community approval. Rachel's initial discomfort around Blackwood, that vague unease she mentioned to friends but never formally reported, highlights how women's instinctive concerns are still too often dismissed as overreactions. In a society still grappling with gender-based violence, taking such warnings seriously remains a critical lesson. When Rachel felt uncomfortable about Blackwood's attention and unnecessary service calls, she was picking up on real danger signals that a more responsive system might have recognized. The case also demonstrates the transformative power of technological advancement in the criminal justice system. Forensic genealogy, a technique that didn't exist when Rachel disappeared in 2006, ultimately provided the breakthrough a decade later. This sends a message that investing in scientific innovation is essential for addressing unsolved crimes and providing long-delayed justice to victims' families. For communities across America facing similar traumas, Pinewood's journey offers hope that healing is possible even after profound betrayal. By transforming Blackwood's auto shop into the Rachel Sutton Memorial Center, the town reclaimed the physical space associated with her killer, converting a symbol of deception into one of education and support. This represents how communities can acknowledge painful histories while creating meaningful pathways forward. Finally, Rachel's legacy, inspiring her sister to join the Texas Rangers and helping solve other cold cases, reminds us that even in tragedy, positive change can emerge. The Rachel Sutton case demonstrates that while justice may arrive late, persistent pursuit of truth remains essential, not just for individual victims, but for maintaining the fabric of trust that binds communities together. So stay vigilant, trust your instincts, and remember that justice, though sometimes delayed for years, will eventually find its way to the surface, just as Rachel's silver car emerged from the Red River after so many years of darkness. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.